The worst mistake a powerful man can make is staying silent when it matters. The glass slipped from my hand before I even realized my fingers had gone numb. Crystal shattering against the marble floor in a sharp, echoing crack that seemed too loud for a place like this, too real for a room built on polished smiles and expensive lies. And for a second, everything stopped, conversations fading into a hush, eyes turning, but not toward me, never toward me, always just past me, like I was part of the furniture, like the girl in the black uniform didn't belong in their world, unless she was invisible, and I stayed frozen there, heart racing, breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, staring down at the thin red line forming across my palm where the glass had kissed my skin, not deep, not serious, just enough to sting, just enough to remind me I was still here, still standing, still pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't, especially when it wasn't. Because that's what you do when you need the job, when rent is due in 5 days and your bank account doesn't care how tired you are, how scared you are, how badly you want out. You just keep going. You smile, you apologize, you kneel down, and start picking up the pieces like it's your fault the world keeps breaking around you. And that's when I felt it. Not a touch, not a sound, just a shift in the air, like the room had tilted ever so slightly in one direction, like gravity itself had decided to pay attention, and I looked up, slowly, because something inside me already knew. And there he was, sitting at the center table like he owned not just the restaurant but the silence wrapped around it. Dominic Moretti, dark suit, perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched in the last 10 minutes. His gaze locked on me with a kind of calm that wasn't comfort, wasn't kindness, just awareness, sharp and measured, like he was reading something written beneath my skin. And for a second, just 1 second, I thought he might say something, might move, might do anything at all, because everyone knew who he was, what he could do, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, the kind of man people listened to before he even spoke. And I waited, God, I waited, my fingers tightening around the broken glass, ignoring the sting, ignoring the way my pulse thundered in my ears, because if someone like him saw something wrong, he would fix it, right? That's what power meant. That's what I'd always believed, but he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, just watched, quiet and unreadable, like none of it mattered, like I didn't matter, and the silence stretched long enough to hurt, long enough to understand. And in that moment, kneeling on cold marble with blood on my hand and a room full of people pretending not to see, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Power doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it just watches, and that hurt more than anything else ever could. I finished cleaning the glass because that is what you do when nobody else will. You make the mess disappear like it never happened, even if your hands are shaking and your chest feels too tight to breathe properly. And when I stood up, I kept my head down, not because I was ashamed, but because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing it on my face, the sting in my palm fading into something dull and constant, like a reminder I could not turn off. And I walked back toward the service station with steady steps that I did not feel, counting each one like it mattered, like control could be rebuilt in inches, in seconds, in silence. And I told myself not to look at him again, not to check if he was still watching, because it should not matter, he should not matter, but something pulled at me anyway, something stubborn and human, and before I could stop myself, I glanced up, just once, and he was still there, exactly the same, posture relaxed, expression unreadable, like nothing had shifted, like nothing had broken, like I had imagined the entire moment. And that was worse somehow, because it meant the silence was not hesitation, it was choice, and that realization settled heavy in my chest, colder than the air conditioning that hummed softly above us, colder than the marble beneath my shoes, colder than the rain I could see streaking down the tall windows facing Fifth Avenue. And I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stop trembling as I reached for a clean tray, forcing my voice steady when a manager brushed past me and muttered something about being more careful, like it had all been my fault, like it always was. And I nodded because arguing would cost me more than pride. It would cost me hours, money, stability, the fragile balance I had built one double shift at a time. But inside, something was shifting, something quiet but irreversible, like a door closing without a sound. and by the time I returned to the floor, weaving through tables and polite laughter and the soft clink of silverware, I already knew I was leaving, not tomorrow, not next week, but soon, because staying meant accepting that moment, accepting that silence, accepting that I could stand 10 feet away from power and still be invisible, and I refused to build my life around that kind of truth. I refused to shrink myself into something easier to ignore, and as I passed his table again, I did not slow down, did not look at him, did not give him the chance to see anything in my face, because whatever I had been waiting for before, whatever small, foolish hope I had held on to, it was gone now, replaced by something steadier, something sharper, and when my shift finally ended at 11:42, I untied my apron with careful fingers, folded it like it mattered, like I mattered, and placed it on the counter without a word, ignoring the confused look from the night supervisor, ignoring the questions I knew would come, because some decisions do not need explanations, they just need distance. And as I pushed open the back door and stepped into the cool night air, the city stretching wide and indifferent around me, I exhaled for what felt like the first time all evening, the sound quiet, almost lost beneath the distant hum of traffic, and I did not look back, not at the building, not at the windows glowing warm behind me, and definitely not at the man inside who had watched everything and chosen nothing, because whatever power he held in that room, it had no hold on me anymore, not after tonight. The city felt different when you walked away without a place to return to, not louder, not quieter, just honest in a way it had not been before, like the lights along the avenue were no longer decoration but exposure. Every reflection in the glass storefronts catching pieces of me I had been too busy to notice, the exhaustion in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders, the way I kept flexing my fingers like I could still feel the sting from earlier, even though the cut had already started to close, and I kept walking anyway, past familiar corners and late-night diners, and people who did not know my name, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying that moment over and over again. The silence, the way he had looked at me like he understood everything and still chose to do nothing, and I refused to let that be the last thing that defined me. So I walked until my apartment building came into view, 3 stories of chipped paint and flickering hallway lights. Nothing like the polished world I had just left, but it was mine, or at least as close to mine as anything had ever been, and when I pushed open the front door, the smell of old carpet and overworked heating pipes wrapped around me like something familiar, something real, and I climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, until I reached my door and fumbled for my keys, my hands finally betraying me now that no one was watching, trembling just enough to make the metal scrape against the lock before it finally turned, and inside, everything was exactly where I had left it that morning, small kitchen, narrow couch, a stack of unpaid bills sitting on the table like quiet reminders of reality, and I leaned back against the door after closing it, letting the silence settle around me, letting the weight of the day press in without interruption, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself feel it, the disappointment, not in him, not entirely, but in myself for expecting anything at all, for believing that someone like him would step in for someone like me without a reason, without a benefit, without a transaction attached. And that thought stung more than the glass ever had, because it meant I had been naive in a way I could not afford to be, not anymore. And I pushed myself off the door, moving through the apartment with slow, deliberate motions, turning on the lamp, setting my keys down, running water over my hand to clean the faint trace of red I had missed earlier, watching it swirl down the drain like it was nothing, like it had never mattered, and maybe it did not, maybe none of it did, except for the part where I had stayed too long in a place that had already decided I did not belong, and that was something I could fix, something I could change, and I grabbed my phone from the counter, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed, a small clinic downtown that had been looking for extra help, lower pay, longer hours, but honest work that did not depend on pretending I was invisible, and I hesitated for half a second before pressing call, listening to the ring echo in the quiet apartment, steady and certain, like a decision finally made, and when someone answered on the other end, I heard my own voice come out calm, clear, stronger than I felt, asking about the position, asking about availability, asking about a future that did not include that restaurant, that room, or that man who had watched and done nothing. And as I stood there in the soft yellow light of my kitchen, I realized something else, something even quieter, but just as certain. Leaving was not the hardest part. It was just the beginning, and whatever came next, it would be mine, not something handed to me, not something controlled by someone else, but something I chose, step by step, even if it meant starting over from nothing again. The next morning came too quickly, like the city had decided I did not get time to process anything. Sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and sharp lines that landed across my face and pulled me out of a sleep that never felt complete. And for a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, disoriented, caught between the version of my life that had existed yesterday and the one I had stepped into without fully understanding it. And then it hit me, the restaurant, the silence, the decision, and my chest tightened before I forced myself to sit up, swinging my feet onto the cold floor, grounding myself in something real, something immediate, because there was no going back now, not mentally, not emotionally, not even practically, and I moved through my morning slower than usual, not because I had time, but because every action felt like it carried weight, like brushing my teeth, pulling my hair back, choosing what to wear. All of it mattered in a way it had not before, like I was rebuilding something from the ground up, and I could not afford to get the foundation wrong. And by the time I stepped outside, the air was crisp, early fall settling into the city, people already moving, with purpose along the sidewalks, coffee in hand, conversations blending into the steady rhythm of traffic and footsteps. And for the first time in a long time, I was not rushing to keep up, I was choosing where I was going. Even if that direction still felt uncertain, and my phone buzzed in my hand as I walked, the number unfamiliar, and I hesitated for a second before answering, my pulse quickening just enough to remind me that change always came with risk, and the voice on the other end was warm, professional, confirming the conversation from the night before, asking if I could come in later that day to talk about the position, to see the place, to start something new. And I found myself saying yes without overthinking it, without doubting it, because hesitation had kept me stuck before, and I was done with that version of myself. And when the call ended, I exhaled slowly, a small smile pulling at the corner of my lips despite everything, because for the first time in a long time, something felt possible, something felt like it belonged to me, and I turned onto the next street, already mapping out the rest of my day in my head, when a black car pulled up along the curb ahead of me, smooth, deliberate, out of place in a neighborhood where most cars had seen better days, and I slowed instinctively, not out of fear, but out of awareness, the kind you learn when life teaches you to pay attention to the details. And the engine cut off, the driver's door opening with quiet precision, and I felt that same shift in the air I had felt the night before, subtle but undeniable, like something controlled had entered a space that was not used to being controlled, and I stopped walking entirely this time, my breath steady, my posture straight, because whatever this was, whoever this was, I was not going to shrink from it, not again. And when the man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not belong to this street, I did not need an introduction to know exactly who had sent him, because some presences did not need to announce themselves to be understood. And as he approached, stopping a few feet away from me with a respectful distance that felt intentional, not accidental, I met his gaze without hesitation, waiting, not for permission, not for explanation, just for the truth of why he was here. And when he finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone used to delivering messages that mattered, I realized something else entirely. Leaving had been my decision, but whatever came next, it was already reaching for me. He did not introduce himself, which somehow made everything feel more official, more deliberate, like names were unnecessary when the message already carried enough weight. And I watched him carefully as he spoke, his tone respectful but firm, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be taken seriously. And when he said Dominic Moretti would like to speak with me, I felt something in my chest shift again, not fear, not exactly, but something sharper, something that remembered the night before too clearly to pretend this was coincidence. And I let a second pass before responding, long enough to show that I was not rushing, not eager, not the same girl who had waited for a reaction that never came. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, even, controlled in a way I had not known I was capable of, asking why. Because that mattered now. The reason mattered more than the request itself, and the man hesitated, just slightly, before answering that some things were better. Discussed in person, which was not an answer. Not really. But it told me enough. Told me this was not about convenience. Not about a simple conversation, and I glanced at the car behind him, sleek, polished, out of place against the cracked sidewalk and faded storefronts. A reminder of the world I had just walked away from. The world that had chosen silence over action. And I felt that same quiet resistance settle into place. Inside me, stronger now, more defined, and I shook my head once. Not dramatic, not emotional, just final. Telling him I had somewhere else to be, that I had already made other plans, and for a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. The passing cars, the distant voices, all of it fading into the background as the decision landed between us, and I could see it in his expression, the calculation, the understanding that this was not the response he had expected, because people did not usually say no to men like Dominic Moretti, not directly, not without hesitation, but I was not thinking about him anymore, not in the same way, because whatever power he held had already failed me once, and I was not about to step back into that without a reason I could respect. And the man in front of me nodded slowly, accepting the answer without argument, which surprised me more than anything else, because I had expected pressure, insistence, something to push me toward that car, but instead he simply reached into his jacket and handed me a small envelope, plain, unmarked, nothing about it indicating importance except the way he held it, careful, deliberate, like it mattered more than it appeared to, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. Feeling the weight of it settle into my hand, light but present, like a question waiting to be opened, and he stepped back after that, giving me space, real space, before returning to the car without another word, the door closing softly, the engine starting with the same quiet precision, and I stood there on the sidewalk watching it pull away, blending back into the flow of the city like it had never been there at all, leaving me with nothing but the envelope and the echo of a decision I had not fully made yet. And for a moment, I considered throwing it away, leaving it unopened, choosing distance completely. But my fingers tightened slightly around the paper instead, because walking away from something did not mean you stopped wanting to understand it. And as I slipped the envelope into my bag and continued down the street toward the clinic, I realized this was not over, not yet, because some silences do not end when you leave them behind. They follow you, waiting for you to decide what they really meant. I did not open the envelope right away, not when I reached the clinic, not when I sat in the small waiting area with its faded blue chairs and quiet hum of fluorescent lights, not even when the receptionist smiled at me and asked me to fill out a simple form with a borrowed pen that scratched slightly against the paper, because opening it felt like stepping back into something I had just walked away from, and I needed to prove to myself that I could exist outside of that world, even for a few hours. Even just long enough to remember who I was without it. And so I focused on the present, on the steady rhythm of the clinic, the soft murmur of voices behind closed doors, the scent of antiseptic mixed with coffee, ordinary, grounded, real in a way the restaurant had never been. And when the interview began, I answered questions carefully but honestly, speaking about long shifts and difficult customers and why I wanted something different, something more stable, more meaningful, leaving out the parts that did not belong in a room like this, the parts that could not be explained without sounding like something out of a story no one would believe, and the woman across from me nodded as I spoke, her expression thoughtful, her questions practical, and for the first time since the night before, I felt seen in a way that did not make me uncomfortable, seen without being measured, without being evaluated for anything other than what I could actually do. And when she told me they could use someone like me, that they needed reliability more than perfection, I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight for longer than I realized. And I thanked her, genuinely, not because I needed to impress her, but because I meant it, because this felt like something I had chosen instead of something I had fallen into. And when I stepped back outside into the late afternoon light, the city felt different again, not heavy this time, but open, like the streets, stretched a little wider, like the noise carried less weight. And I walked a few blocks before stopping at a small bench near a corner cafe, finally pulling the envelope from my bag, turning it over once in my hands, noticing how plain it was, how intentional that plainness felt, like whatever was inside did not need decoration to matter, and I hesitated for just a second before opening it, sliding the paper free with careful fingers, my eyes scanning the contents quickly at first, then slowing as the meaning settled in. Not a letter, not an explanation, just a single sheet with an address, a time, and a line written in clean, precise handwriting that I recognized without ever having seen it before, a kind of control in the way the letters were formed, a kind of certainty that did not ask for attention but demanded it anyway. And beneath that, a simple sentence, no apology, no excuse, just 5 words that felt heavier than anything else he could have written. I should have said something, and I stared at it longer than I expected, longer than I wanted to admit, because it was not enough. It could never be enough to undo what had already happened, but it was not nothing either, not empty, not careless, and that made it harder, not easier, because it meant he understood, at least in part, what his silence had cost, and I exhaled slowly, folding the paper back along its crease, my fingers lingering for a second before slipping it back into the envelope. Because now the question was no longer whether he had noticed, it was whether I was willing to listen, and as I sat there with the city moving around me, cars passing, voices rising and falling, life continuing without pause, I realized that walking away had been simple compared to this. Compared to deciding what to do when something you had already left behind reached back with something that sounded almost like regret. I did not go home right away, even after the sun dipped lower and the city lights began to take over, because sitting alone with that envelope in my apartment felt too quiet, too final, like I would be forced to make a decision before I was ready to understand it. So I kept walking, letting the rhythm of the streets carry me forward, past storefronts glowing warm against the early evening air, past people laughing over dinner, past everything that continued without pause, and I kept hearing those 5 words in my head, not loud, not demanding, just steady, repeating in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I tried to dismiss them, tried to tell myself they were too late, too little, too convenient, because regret after the fact does not change the moment that already happened. It does not erase the silence that came when it mattered most. And I had built my decision on that truth, on the understanding that I deserved better than being overlooked, even by someone powerful enough to change everything with a single word. But the problem with truth is that it is rarely simple. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else had been there that night, something I had not wanted to see at the time, not hesitation, not indifference, but calculation, the kind that weighs consequences in seconds, the kind that does not move unless it is certain. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant his silence might not have been about me at all. It might have been about something bigger, something I did not understand, and I stopped walking when that realization settled in, standing on the corner as traffic lights shifted from green to yellow to red, the city moving around me while I stayed still, caught between what I knew and what I did not, and I pulled the envelope out again, unfolding the paper with slower hands this time, reading the address carefully, recognizing the part of the city it belonged to, quieter, more private, the kind of place people did not stumble into by accident, and I checked the time written beneath it, realizing it was not far from now, close enough that this was not meant to sit unanswered, close enough that whatever he wanted to say was already waiting, and I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the choice settle in fully for the first time, because this was not about him anymore, not entirely, it was about me. About whether I was willing to confront something unfinished, something unresolved, or if I would walk away completely and never look back. And for a long moment, I stood there listening to the sounds of the city, the distant honk of a horn, the low hum of engines, the murmur of voices blending into something almost comforting, and I realized I did not want questions lingering in the background of my life. I did not want to spend months wondering what he would have said, what I might have learned, what could have been different if I had stayed long enough to hear it. And that realization was not about forgiveness, not about trust. It was about closure, about clarity, about choosing to face something directly instead of letting it follow me in silence. And before I could second guess it, before I could talk myself out of it, I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into my bag, raising my hand to flag down a cab as it approached the corner, the driver slowing just enough for me to open the door and slide inside. The interior warm, the faint scent of air freshener mixing with the low hum of the engine, and when he asked where to, I gave the address without hesitation. hearing it leave my mouth with a certainty that surprised even me. Because whatever waited at that location, whatever explanation, whatever truth, I was going to hear it, not as the girl who had waited for someone else to act, but as someone who had already learned what silence costs, and would not accept it again without an answer. The cab ride was quieter than I expected, the city lights streaking past the window in blurred lines of gold and white. Each block carrying me further from the version of myself that had walked away the night before and closer to something I could not yet define, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, fingers still occasionally brushing against the edge of the envelope inside my bag, like I needed to remind myself this was real, that I had chosen this, that I was not being pulled into it without control. And when the car finally slowed, turning onto a street that felt different from the rest of the city, calmer, more deliberate, I straightened slightly, my gaze sharpening as I took in the details, the clean sidewalks, the quiet buildings, the kind of place where nothing happened by accident, and the driver pulled up to the address without needing to double-check, like it was already known, already understood, and I paid, stepped out, and for a moment just stood there, looking at the building in front of me, tall but understated, no sign, no obvious indication of what it was, or who it belonged to, just presence, controlled and intentional, and I exhaled slowly before walking forward, each step measured, not hesitant, not rushed, just steady, because whatever waited inside, I was meeting it on my terms, not his, not anyone else's, and the door opened before I reached for it, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to let me know I had been expected, and I stepped inside without comment. The interior quiet, polished, the kind of quiet that was not empty but contained, like every sound had been decided in advance, and a man nodded once in acknowledgment before guiding me down a hallway without speaking, his pace unhurried, his posture precise, and I followed without question, because I had already chosen to be here, already decided I would see this through, and when we stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, he stepped aside, opening it just enough for me to enter, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in a room that felt both simple and deliberate, a desk, a chair, soft lighting that did not strain the eyes, nothing unnecessary, nothing distracting, and for a second, I just stood there, taking it in, letting the silence settle around me, not the kind of silence that had hurt me before, but something different, something waiting, something unfinished, and then I heard it, the quiet sound of a door behind me closing, not loud, not sharp, just enough to shift the air, and I turned slowly, already knowing who would be there. Before I even saw him, Dominic Moretti standing a few feet away, exactly as I remembered, composed, controlled. But there was something else now, something subtle but undeniable, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the way he looked at me, not assessing, not distant, but focused in a way that felt deliberate, like this moment mattered in a way the last one had not. And for a second, neither of us spoke. The space between us holding everything that had not been said before, everything that had led to this point. And I realized then that this was not about power, not in the way I had understood it before, because power had been present the night he stayed silent, and it had done nothing. But this moment, this choice to face me directly, to say whatever he had come to say without the shield of distance or distraction, this felt different, and I held his gaze without stepping back, without lowering my eyes. Because whatever he was about to say, whatever explanation he thought he could offer, I was no longer the person who would accept it without question, and the silence stretched just long enough to make it clear that this time, he was the one choosing his words carefully, and I waited, not for him to prove his power, but to prove that he understood exactly what his silence had cost. He did not step closer, and somehow that mattered more than if he had. The space between us left intact, like he understood that distance was something he had to earn back, not take. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I remembered, not weaker, not uncertain, but deliberate in a way that made every word feel chosen. I saw it, he said, simple, direct, no attempt to soften it or explain it away. And I felt something in my chest tighten at that, not because I did not already know, but because hearing it confirmed something I had been trying to ignore. That his silence had never been about ignorance. It had been about decision, and I held his gaze, not interrupting, not helping him find the right words, because that was not my responsibility anymore. And he continued after a second, slower this time, like he was measuring the weight of what he was saying, and I should have stepped in. And there it was again, not an apology dressed up in excuses, not a justification, just truth. And I crossed my arms lightly, grounding myself in something physical as I let the words settle, because part of me wanted to accept them, wanted to believe that recognition alone meant something had changed, but another part of me, the part that had walked out that door the night before, knew better than to let a few sentences undo everything I had learned. And I shook my head once, not dismissive, not angry, just clear. You did not, I said, my voice steady, and the words hung between us, heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because they were not about the past, they were about the consequence of it. And he nodded, slightly, like he accepted that, like he was not going to argue with something that was already true. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence returning, but it felt different now, not empty, not careless, just honest. And I studied him then, really looked at him in a way I had not allowed myself to before, noticing the small details, the tension held just beneath his calm expression, the way his hands remained still at his sides, like he was controlling more than just his words. And I realized something that shifted everything again. He was not here to convince me. He was here to acknowledge something he could not undo. And that mattered, not because it fixed anything, but because it changed the way I saw this moment. And I let out a slow breath, lowering my arms as I spoke again, quieter this time, but no less certain. I am not the same person who stood there waiting. And his eyes sharpened slightly at that, not in challenge, but in recognition, like he understood exactly what I meant. And I took a small step back, not retreating, just setting the boundary where it needed to be. And I am not going back to that, I added, because that was the part that mattered most, the part that defined everything else. And he nodded again, slower this time, his gaze steady on mine as he replied, I am not asking you to. And something about that answer caught me off guard, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not. No demand, no expectation, just acceptance. And the room felt different again, the tension shifting into something quieter, something unfinished but no longer unresolved. And I realized then that this was not about whether I would forgive him or not. It was about whether I would carry that moment with me as something that defined me, or something I had already moved beyond. And as I stood there, looking at the man who had once held all the power in that room and chosen silence, I understood something I had not seen before. Power does not come from who can change a situation. It comes from who decides what that situation means to them after it is over. And I turned toward the door, not running, not hesitating, just choosing. And as my hand reached for the handle, I paused for a fraction of a second before speaking one last time, not looking back. Next time, do not wait. And then I stepped out, leaving the room, the silence, and him behind, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled me.